You probably think you're a good person because you always give more than you take. You think people-pleasing is a virtue. People like you. You believe that taking on the burden of others, working harder than everyone else, and constantly sacrificing your own needs is just a sign of your generous nature. But the truth is, unfortunately, much darker than that. In my last video, I told you the story of Eileen, and Eileen was a chronic people pleaser who was energetically starving. We physically rebuilt the missing sectors of her house to give her stability. And as soon as she finally felt safe, she became furious. So today we're going to talk about why you may be completely unaware of how much rage you're carrying. We're going to explore where your unexpressed anger is physically destroying your body and how we can trace that anger all the way back to your physical environment sometimes, and sometimes even to your ancestors. To understand your anger, you have to understand your biology. Whenever we lack internal stability, our nervous system completely inhibits our drive for conflict. We are taught that conflict is a bad thing. But in psychology and in Chinese medicine, healthy conflict simply means having a voice. It is the courage to state what you need regardless of whether others approve. If you had a childhood where you did not receive enough emotional presence, connection, validation, a primal psychological reflex was triggered. That reflex boiled down to one belief: I am not worthy. This isn't just low self-esteem. It is an ancient survival tactic. Imagine a family hundreds of years ago with 10 children and scarce resources. If a parent disliked one of those children, that child's chances of survival dropped almost to zero. So children learned to adjust their behavior to become perfect, to take on the guilt and appease the parents just to stay alive. Your perfectionism and your need to overgive isn't a virtue. It is a trauma response designed to keep you from being abandoned. And this trauma response creates a highly toxic dynamic in your adult life. In psychology, we call this the drama triangle. When you constantly overgive, when you try to save people, you go into savior mode. You automatically cast the other person as the helpless victim, and whatever the situation they are facing, as the big bad wolf. You step in trying to play God, deciding that it is your absolute responsibility to make their suffering go away. Yay, Superman. But think about the absurdity of this. You take on responsibilities that are obviously not yours. You do things on their behalf without even being asked. And by trying to save them, you're actually stripping them of their autonomy, infantilizing them, and disempowering them from making the choices that are rightfully theirs to make, to extricate themselves from that situation. You tell yourself you're being helpful, but you have actually become a mixture of a savior and a control freak. At best, you're far too involved in their life for their own good and yours. At worst, your generosity has become a domineering mechanism to control the people around you. But what happens to the natural human frustration of constantly playing this role and putting yourself and your needs last? It doesn't just disappear. It gets buried. In Chinese medicine, the spectrum of conflictual emotions, frustration, fury, resentment, and rage, is stored directly in the wood element, which corresponds to your liver and gallbladder. Because you suppress these emotions to stay safe, you might genuinely believe you aren't an angry person, but your body is keeping the score. When suppressed wood energy reaches a boiling point, it may create a pathology we call liver yang rising. The energy of the liver violently shoots upwards along the gallbladder meridian, which runs over your shoulders and your neck and into your head. So if you suffer from chronic tension in your shoulders, hypertension, neck pain, severe migraines, that is your unvoiced anger. But it doesn't stop there. Repressed wood element manifests sometimes as autoimmune diseases, severe bloating that has no connection to the food you ate, and unexplained joint pain. Because liver qi governs the free flow of blood, suppressed anger destroys your hormonal and reproductive balance. It may cause irregular and sometimes incredibly painful or completely absent menstrual cycles. It tanks your libido and therefore affects your relationship with your loved one. It may cause eye problems. It may cause glaucoma. It may cause difficulty focusing. And perhaps most tellingly, it causes the exact type of insomnia, where you wake up agitated between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., which is the biological time of the liver. And you wake up the next morning feeling like you haven't rested at all. As a practitioner, I don't use your Patsa astrology chart to simply diagnose if you have repressed anger. Your body is telling me that already. I look at the mathematical blueprint of your chart to understand exactly where that anger is coming from so we can address it. For example, if you have what is called a weak daymaster, your foundational energy is low. You refuse to manifest your anger out of the terrifying fear that your fragile foundation will collapse if you start a fight. Conversely, if you have a so-called strong daymaster, your mechanism is different. You have far more energy coming in than going out, so your energy stagnates. And when that massive voltage has nowhere to go, it can erupt into explosive frustration, or worse, it can implode into a very dark, heavy depression. We also look in the Patsa chart at the balance of the elements, specifically here, metal and wood. Metal element is supposed to elegantly sculpt, regulate the wood element, giving your assertiveness a healthy shape. But if your metal is far too weak to regulate the wood or far too heavy and it crushes it, the system breaks down. We can also look in the Patsa chart for internal conflicts where different parts of your soul want different things, and that may leave you kind of paralyzed. But also remember, the internal and the external also must rise together. Your physical house can also be the source of your liver pathology. In classical Feng Shui, the Chinese circadian clock is mapped directly onto the compass of your home. The gallbladder, for example, corresponds to the time of the rat, which sits exactly in the North 2 sector of your house. The liver corresponds to the time of the ox, which sits in the Northeast 1 sector. If you have negative external forms outside your house on those exact degrees, like for example, sharp corners of neighboring buildings, electrical or telecommunications antennas, aggressive spikes, all these act like physical poison darts aimed directly at your physical organs. It is perfectly fine to spend time in the east and southeast sectors of your home, which correspond to the wood element. But if those areas hold also the wood flying stars 3 or 4, and those stars are activated by negative external influences, for example, your environment is actively channeling your wood energy into destructive rage. But here is also the beautiful part. If your home is utilized correctly, and this is what we can do with a Feng Shui consult, we can actually use the Feng Shui of your space to channel your frustration away from depression and rage and transform it into healthy assertiveness and decisive action. To finally vent this anger, the foundation of your insecurity must be fixed. You must become safe enough, stable enough to speak. But there is one final insidious source of rage that we haven't discussed yet. Sometimes you do the somatic work, you fix your Feng Shui, you get regular acupuncture treatments, and yet the heavy, suffocating anger is still there. This is the fundamental difference between standard traditional Chinese medicine and karmic acupuncture. Standard TCM treats liver stagnation basically superficially, but if the root of that anger doesn't belong to you, standard needles will never reach it. Because you see, sometimes the anger you're carrying isn't even yours. We as people are not isolated islands. We belong to a family system, and sometimes the dynamics of these systems may result in us carrying the unresolved fury, frustration, anger of our ancestors, the burdens that they had. And you might be carrying the unresolved fury and the burden of the ancestors who came before you for things that didn't even happen in your lifetime. So next week, we're going to analyze these dynamics found in family constellations, and I'm going to show you how the year pillar of your parts of the chart reveals this ancestral debt, and how to finally put down that luggage that is breaking your back. Until then, observe your body. If you're in pain, ask yourself this: what is the truth I am too terrified to speak?